Portland, Oregon, 1985. The rain was relentless, drumming on the windshield as Sarah Thompson maneuvered her beat-up Ford Escort down a winding suburban road. 32. She was used to tough days. Raising a teenager alone, juggling bills and working long hours at the bank. But today felt heavier. Her great-aunt Mildred had passed away 2 weeks ago, leaving Sarah her old Victorian house. It was a chance at a fresh start, or so she told herself, though the thought of moving into a creaky, century-old place made her stomach twist. Beside her, Ethan, her 15-year-old son, slouched in the passenger seat, his Walkman blaring the Smiths loud enough for Sarah to hear the tinny beat. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and his sneakers tapped restlessly. "This place better have cable," he muttered, barely looking up from the comic book in his lap. Sarah forced a smile. "It's a house, Ethan, not a hotel. We'll make it ours." She didn't mention the real plan: fix it up, sell it, and use the money for his college fund. Ethan didn't need to know how tight things were. The house loomed into view as they turned onto a quiet street lined with oaks. It was 3 stories of faded gray wood, with a sagging porch and tall, narrow windows that looked like half-closed eyes. Ivy clung to the walls, and the garden was a tangle of weeds. Sarah parked, her heart sinking. It was worse than she'd imagined. "Looks like a haunted mansion," Ethan said, a grin creeping across his face. "Cool. Looks like a money pit," Sarah replied, grabbing their duffel bags from the trunk. The air smelled of wet leaves and moss, and the rain left puddles on the cracked walkway. Inside, the house was no better. The foyer was dim, with peeling wallpaper and a chandelier coated in dust. The hardwood floor creaked underfoot, and a faint musty odor hung in the air like old books left in a damp cellar. Ethan dropped his bag and wandered into the living room, where a boxy CRT television sat next to a worn couch. "No cable," he groaned, flopping onto the cushions. Sarah ignored him, her eyes scanning the high ceilings and ornate moldings. The place had potential, she told herself, but it felt off, like the house was watching her. "Let's check the upstairs," she said, hoping to distract Ethan from his complaints. They climbed the narrow staircase, the wood groaning with each step. The second floor had a few bedrooms sparsely furnished with heavy oak beds and faded curtains. Ethan claimed the largest one, its window overlooking the backyard's gnarled apple tree. The attic was last. Sarah pulled the cord to lower the rickety ladder, dust swirling in the dim light. "Careful," she warned as Ethan scrambled up. The attic was a maze of boxes, trunks, and cobwebs lit by a single bare bulb. Old furniture, chairs with broken legs, a cracked mirror, sat in piles, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Ethan poked through a stack of crates, pulling out a chipped porcelain doll. "Creepy," he said, tossing it aside. Sarah moved to a corner where a large, rectangular object was draped in a dusty sheet. She tugged the cloth away, revealing a wooden trunk, its surface carved with swirling vines. The lock was rusted but loose, and with a creak, she pried it open. Inside was a portrait, nearly 4 feet tall, framed in dark oak. It depicted a woman, maybe in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her black dress was severe, buttoned to the chin, and her face was stern, lips pressed into a thin line. But her eyes, gray, piercing, almost glowing, made Sarah freeze. They seemed to stare right through her, alive in a way no painting should be. "Whoa," Ethan said, stepping closer. "She's intense. Like she's judging us." Sarah's skin prickled, a chill running down her spine. "Probably some old relative," she said, trying to sound casual. But her voice wavered. The attic felt colder now, the bulb flickering faintly. She wanted to cover the portrait again, shove it back in the trunk, but Ethan was already lifting it out. "Can I have it?" he asked, his eyes bright with excitement. "It'd look awesome in my room." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct screamed to say no, but Ethan's grin was rare these days. She didn't want to squash his enthusiasm over a silly painting. "Fine," she said, forcing a laugh. "But if it gives you nightmares, don't blame me." They carried the portrait downstairs, its weight surprising for its size. Ethan propped it against his bedroom wall next to his Ramones poster. The woman's eyes seemed to follow Sarah as she left the room, but she shook it off. It was just a painting, she told herself. Old houses played tricks on the mind. That night, Sarah lay in her new bedroom, the rain pattering against the window. The house creaked and settled, each sound making her jump. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a faint whisper, like a voice calling her name. "Sarah," it came from upstairs, soft but clear, slipping under the door. She sat up, heart pounding. The clock read 2:17 a.m. She grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hall to Ethan's room. He was sprawled across his bed, snoring softly, his Walkman still looped around his neck. The portrait loomed in the corner, its frame catching the moonlight. The woman's eyes seemed brighter, sharper, like they were watching her. Sarah's breath caught, but she forced herself to look away. It was just her imagination, fueled by an old house and too little sleep. She checked the attic next, the ladder creaking under her weight. The bulb buzzed, casting long shadows. The trunk was still open, its contents untouched, but the air felt heavy, like someone had just left the room. She hurried back downstairs, locking the attic door behind her. The next morning, Ethan was at the kitchen table, eating cereal and flipping through his sketchbook. Sarah glanced at his latest drawing, a woman's face, stern and gray-eyed with the same tight bun as the portrait. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she meant. Ethan shrugged, not looking up. "Dunno. Saw her in a dream. She was talking to me." He closed the sketchbook quickly, his cheeks flushing. Sarah's stomach twisted, but she didn't push. It was just a coincidence, she told herself. Kids drew weird things. Still, as she poured her coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house and the woman in the portrait knew more about them than they did about it. The next few days in the Victorian house felt like a test of Sarah Thompson's nerves. The rain hadn't let up, cloaking Portland in a gray haze that seeped into her mood. She went through the motions, unpacking boxes, scrubbing floors, calling repairmen for the leaky roof. But the portrait in Ethan's room lingered in her thoughts. Those gray eyes, sharp and unyielding, seemed to watch her every time she passed his door. She told herself it was just an old painting, a relic from a forgotten relative. But the unease grew, a knot in her chest she couldn't untie. Ethan, meanwhile, was retreating into himself. He'd always been a quiet kid, more comfortable with his sketchbook than with people. But now he was different. He barely spoke at breakfast, his eyes glued to his cereal bowl. And when Sarah asked about school, he shrugged her off. His Walkman was on constantly, the tinny wail of punk rock leaking from his headphones. Sarah caught him staring at the portrait more than once, his expression blank, like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. By Wednesday, the house started playing tricks. Sarah was in the kitchen, sorting through Mildred's chipped teacups, when a door upstairs slammed shut. She froze, her hands trembling. Ethan was at school, and the house was empty. She grabbed a flashlight. Portland's gloom made every room dim, and climbed the creaky stairs. The sound had come from the second floor, near Ethan's room. His door was closed, though she swore she'd left it open. She pushed it gently, half expecting to see the portrait staring back. The room was empty, the portrait still propped against the wall, its frame catching a sliver of light from the rain-streaked window. The woman's eyes seemed to glint, but Sarah shook her head. "Get a grip," she muttered, checking the window. It was latched tight, no draft to blame. As she turned to leave, a chill brushed her neck, like a cold finger trailing across her skin. She spun around, heart pounding, but nothing was there. Just the portrait, silent and still. That night, Sarah dreamed of the woman. She was in a dark room, lit only by flickering candles. The woman, Eleanor, she somehow knew, stood before her, her black dress rustling like dry leaves. "You took what's mine," Eleanor said, her voice low and sharp, cutting through the air. Her eyes burned, not with light but with anger, and her hands reached out, bony and pale. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice caught, and the room dissolved into shadows. She woke gasping, her sheets damp with sweat. The clock read 3:04 a.m., and the house was silent, except for a faint creak from the attic above. She didn't tell Ethan about the dream. He was already acting strange, and she didn't want to scare him. But when she checked his sketchbook that morning, left open on the kitchen table, her breath caught. The pages were filled with drawings of Eleanor. Her stern face, her tight bun, her piercing eyes. The sketches were rough, almost frantic, with jagged lines that didn't match Ethan's usual careful style. Some showed her smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cruel, her lips curled like she knew a secret. Sarah slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. She needed answers. She called Clara Gwynn, a local historian who'd been close to Aunt Mildred. Clara was in her 50s, with a warm smile and a mind like a steel trap for Portland's past. She arrived that afternoon, her raincoat dripping as she stepped into the foyer. "This place hasn't changed much," she said, glancing at the peeling wallpaper. Mildred loved its quirks. Sarah led her to Ethan's room, where the portrait sat. Clara's smile faded as she studied it. "That's Eleanor Grayson," she said, her voice tight. "Lived here in the 1880s. Not a happy woman, from what I've heard." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her stomach twisting. Clara hesitated, adjusting her glasses. There were rumors. Her son, William, died young. Murdered, some said, over a land dispute. People thought Eleanor cursed the family, blamed her for strange things that happened after. Disappearances, accidents. "I never put much stock in it, but—" She trailed off, her eyes fixed on the portrait. "This painting gives me the creeps." Sarah swallowed hard. "Ethan's been drawing her, and I've heard things. Whispers at night." Clara's expression softened, but there was worry in her eyes. "Old houses can play tricks, Sarah. But I'll look into it." Mildred kept records, letters, maybe a diary. "I'll check the Historical Society's archives." Sarah nodded, grateful but uneasy. She didn't mention the dream, or the chill in Ethan's room. Some things felt too fragile to say out loud. Over the next few days, the house grew restless. Sarah was vacuuming the living room when the lights flickered, the bulbs buzzing like angry bees. She checked the fuse box, but everything was fine. Later, a glass slid off the kitchen counter, shattering on the floor, though no one was near it. Each incident was small, easy to explain away, but they piled up, fraying her nerves. She started avoiding Ethan's room, but she couldn't avoid the portrait's pull. Once passing by, she swore the woman's head had tilted slightly, her eyes locking onto hers. She blinked, and it was normal again. Just a trick of the light, she told herself, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Ethan's behavior was worse. He skipped school twice, claiming he was sick, but Sarah found him in his room, staring at the portrait. His sketchbook was now a gallery of Eleanor, dozens of drawings, some showing her standing in the house, others with her hands outstretched, as if reaching for something. "Stop drawing her," Sarah snapped, snatching the book. Ethan glared, his face pale. "You don't get it, Mom. She's talking to me. She needs something." "Enough," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "No more of this." She confiscated the sketchbook, locking it in her bedroom drawer, but Ethan's words haunted her. That night, she heard him moving downstairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. She found him in the living room, standing in the dark, his eyes glassy. "Ethan?" she whispered, touching his shoulder. He didn't respond, just muttered something unintelligible, his voice deeper than it should have been. She shook him gently, and he blinked, confused. "Why am I down here?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Sarah didn't sleep after that. She called Clara the next morning, her voice trembling as she recounted Ethan's sleepwalking and the drawings. Clara promised to visit the archives that day, but she urged Sarah to move the portrait out of Ethan's room. "Just to be safe," she said. Sarah agreed, though the thought of touching the painting made her skin crawl. She waited until Ethan was at school, then steeled herself and entered his room. The portrait seemed larger somehow, its frame darker against the wall. She grabbed the edges, expecting it to be heavy, but it was impossibly so, like it was rooted to the floor. Her fingers burned where they touched the wood, a sharp, stinging pain that made her gasp. She yanked her hands back, red welts forming on her palms. "What are you?" she whispered, staring into the woman's eyes. For a moment she swore they narrowed, a flicker of malice in their gray depths. Sarah draped a sheet over the portrait and dragged it to the attic, her arms aching from the effort. She locked the attic door, shoving a chair against it for good measure. But when she checked Ethan's room later, the portrait was back, propped against the wall, the sheet neatly folded beside it. Her heart stopped. She hadn't heard anyone enter the house, and Ethan was still at school. She backed out of the room, her breath shallow, and called Clara again. Clara arrived that evening, a thick folder tucked under her arm. She'd found something, a diary, tucked away in the Historical Society's basement, written in Eleanor Grayson's tight, slanting script. They sat at the kitchen table, the rain pounding outside, as Clara read aloud. The diary told of William's murder, not by a stranger but by his uncle, Charles Grayson, who wanted the family's land. Eleanor, consumed by grief, had sought out a traveler, a man who claimed to know the old ways. He taught her a ritual, one that would bind her soul to a portrait, letting her watch over the family and punish those who betrayed it. "There's more," Clara said, her voice low. "She mentions a curse, tied to the blood of her descendants. It's not clear what it does, but it's angry. And Sarah?" She hesitated, meeting Sarah's eyes. "Mildred was a Grayson through Charles's line. That makes you and Ethan part of it." Sarah's blood ran cold. "You're saying this thing is after my son?" Clara didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Sarah glanced at the ceiling, toward the attic, where she'd left the portrait or thought she had. The house creaked like it was listening. Ethan came home late, his jacket soaked, his eyes distant. Sarah tried to talk to him, but he brushed past her, heading straight to his room. She followed, her heart sinking as she saw the portrait, still there, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Ethan sat on his bed, staring at it, his hands clenched. "She's not mad at me," he said, his voice flat. "She wants justice for what they did." "Who, Ethan?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What did she say?" He didn't answer, just kept staring. Sarah grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were wrong, dull, like he was half asleep. "You're not yourself," she said, pulling him out of the room. She locked the door, ignoring his protests, and called her brother, Jake. Jake Thompson was 35, a truck driver who'd been estranged from Sarah for years, ever since a fight over their parents' estate. He lived a few hours away, in Seattle, but when Sarah called, her voice breaking, he didn't hesitate. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said, his gruff tone softening. "Just keep Ethan away from that thing." Jake arrived the next afternoon, his pickup rattling into the driveway. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a leather jacket that smelled faintly of cigarettes. He hugged Sarah tightly, something he hadn't done in years, and ruffled Ethan's hair, though Ethan barely responded. "This place is a dump," Jake said, glancing at the sagging porch. "What's with the painting?" Sarah told him everything, the whispers, Ethan's drawings, Clara's findings. Jake snorted, skeptical. "Sounds like you're both stressed. Old houses mess with your head." But when he saw the portrait, his bravado faltered. "Okay, that's creepy," he admitted, stepping back. "Let's burn it." Sarah stopped him. "Clara says we need to understand it first. Burning it might make things worse." Jake rolled his eyes but agreed to help. He and Sarah searched the attic that evening, looking for anything that might explain the portrait. The bulb flickered as they sifted through trunks, finding yellowed letters and faded photographs, most from Mildred's time. Jake pried open a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small wooden box, carved with the same swirling vines as the portrait's frame. It held a bundle of letters, tied with a black ribbon, and a single photograph of Eleanor, her face identical to the painting. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the letters. They were from Eleanor to William, written before his death, full of love and worry. One mentioned Charles, her brother-in-law, and his greedy eyes on their land. "He'll stop at nothing," Eleanor wrote. The last letter was different, scrawled in a frantic hand. "The traveler promised justice, my soul for theirs. Let the portrait see all." Jake frowned, tossing the photograph aside. "This is nuts, Sarah. Let's get that thing out of here." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the attic door, which had swung open on its own, though no one had touched it. A cold draft swept through, carrying a whisper, "Sarah?" It was Eleanor's voice, the same one from her dream, low and sharp, like a blade. She grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him downstairs. The house felt alive now, its walls creaking, its shadows deeper. Ethan was in the living room, his sketchbook open on the coffee table. He'd drawn Eleanor again, but this time, she was standing in the attic, her hands dripping with something dark. "She's here," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "She's always been here." Sarah's heart raced. She didn't know what Eleanor wanted, but she knew one thing. The portrait wasn't just a painting. It was a cage, and something inside it was waking up. Sarah Thompson's hands trembled as she clutched the bundle of Eleanor Grayson's letters. Their brittle pages yellowed with age. The Victorian house seemed to pulse around her, its creaks and groans louder now, like a living thing roused from sleep. It was Friday night, and the rain had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness that made every sound sharper. Ethan sat in the living room, his sketchbook abandoned, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jake paced near the staircase, his jaw tight, while Clara Gwynn spread her notes across the kitchen table, her face pale but determined. "We have to do this tonight," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tension. "The diary's clear. The curse is tied to the portrait, and it's targeting Ethan because he's a Grayson descendant. We need to break it before it takes him." Sarah nodded, though her stomach churned. The idea of a ritual, some mix of old magic and desperate hope, felt absurd, but the past week had shattered her skepticism. The whispers, Ethan's drawings, the portrait's refusal to stay in the attic, it was all real, and it was closing in. She glanced at her son, his face gaunt, his hands twitching like he was fighting something inside. "What do we need?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay calm. Clara opened the diary, pointing to a page scrawled with Eleanor's tight script. "A circle of salt around the portrait, to contain her spirit. Words of apology, read from the diary, to acknowledge Charles's betrayal. And a drop of blood, yours, Sarah, as a descendant of Charles, to seal the ritual. Then we burn the portrait. It should release Eleanor's soul and end the curse." Jake snorted, crossing his arms. "Blood and salt? Sounds like a bad movie. Why not just torch it now? Because that could trap her spirit here." Clara snapped, her patience thin. "Or worse, let it loose without restraint. The ritual is our best shot." Sarah looked at Ethan, who hadn't spoken since his chilling words about Eleanor's justice. His eyes flickered to the ceiling, toward his room, where the portrait waited. "Okay," she said, swallowing hard. "Let's do it." They chose the living room, its high ceiling and wide space better than the cramped attic. Jake hauled the portrait downstairs, grunting as its weight seemed to shift, like it was resisting. Sarah winced at the sight of Eleanor's face, her gray eyes gleaming under the chandelier's dim light. Clara poured a thick circle of table salt on the floor, her hands steady as she muttered a prayer under her breath. Ethan watched from the couch, his expression blank, but Sarah caught him mouthing words she couldn't hear. Sarah placed the portrait in the center of the circle, its frame thudding against the hardwood. The air grew heavy, like a storm was brewing inside the house. Jake stood by the door, a crowbar in hand, ready for anything. Clara handed Sarah the diary, open to the apology Eleanor had written for her son's killers. "Read this," she said. "Mean it. She'll know if you don't." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice shaking as she began. "To those who wronged William Grayson, who took his life for greed, I speak for Charles Grayson and his line. Your actions were a sin, a betrayal of family. I am sorry, Eleanor, for the pain you endured, for the loss you suffered." Her words faltered as the lights flickered, the chandelier swaying gently. A cold wind swept through the room, though every window was closed. Ethan stood suddenly, his eyes wide. "She's here," he whispered, his voice not entirely his own. Sarah's heart skipped, but she kept reading, her voice louder now. "We seek to right this wrong, to free you from your pain. The portrait rattled in its frame, the wood creaking like it was splitting. Clara grabbed a knife from her bag, a small paring knife she'd brought for the ritual. "Your blood, Sarah," she said, pressing it into Sarah's hand. Sarah hesitated, the blade glinting in the flickering light. She pricked her thumb, wincing as a bead of red welled up. She stepped toward the portrait, ready to let the drop fall, but Ethan lunged, his hands clawing at the salt circle. "No!" he shouted, his voice a mix of his own and something deeper, harsher. "She deserves more." He scattered the salt, breaking the circle, and the room erupted. The windows rattled, books flew off the shelves, and a low, guttural scream filled the air. Not from Ethan, but from the portrait itself. Sarah dropped the knife, grabbing Ethan as he thrashed, his strength unnatural. Jake rushed over, pinning Ethan's arms, his face pale. "What's happening?" he yelled. Clara scrambled to repair the salt circle, pouring more from the canister. "She's fighting back," she shouted. "Sarah, keep reading." Sarah fumbled for the diary, her hands slick with sweat. She picked up where she'd left off, her voice hoarse. "We offer this apology, this blood, to end your suffering." She squeezed her thumb, letting a drop fall onto the portrait's canvas. The scream grew louder, a piercing wail that made her ears ring. The portrait's eyes seemed to blaze, Eleanor's face twisting, her mouth opening in a silent snarl. Then Eleanor appeared, not in the painting but in the room, a shimmering figure of shadow and light. Her black dress billowed, her silver hair loose and wild, and her eyes burned with a fury that made Sarah's knees buckle. "You think words can undo my pain?" Eleanor's voice boomed, echoing off the walls. "Blood for blood, child for child." She reached for Ethan, her bony hands outstretched, and Sarah screamed, throwing herself between them. "Take me," she shouted, her voice raw. "Not him. I'm Charles's blood, not Ethan." Eleanor paused, her head tilting, as if considering the offer. The room grew colder, frost forming on the windows, and Sarah felt a pull, like her soul was being tugged toward the portrait. Jake tightened his grip on Ethan, who was still thrashing, muttering in that strange, deep voice. Clara, now standing, grabbed a lighter and a bottle of rubbing alcohol from her bag. "We have to burn it now," she yelled, splashing the alcohol onto the portrait. The canvas hissed like it was alive, and Eleanor's figure flickered, her scream turning to a wail of anguish. Sarah grabbed the lighter from Clara, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not to Eleanor but to the house, to Ethan, to herself. She flicked the lighter, the flame small but steady, and touched it to the portrait. The canvas caught fire instantly, flames licking up Eleanor's painted face. The real Eleanor, or whatever she was, shrieked, her form dissolving into tendrils of smoke that spiraled toward the ceiling. The fire spread, the frame cracking, and Sarah stumbled back, pulling Ethan with her. Ethan gasped, his body going limp in Jake's arms, his eyes clearing. The scream faded, replaced by a low moan, like the house itself was exhaling. The portrait burned to ash, the flames dying out within the salt circle, leaving only a pile of blackened wood and canvas. The air warmed, the lights steadied, and the house fell silent. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching Ethan, who blinked up at her, confused. "Mom," he whispered, his voice his own again. She hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face, as Jake and Clara exchanged stunned looks. But Clara's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she picked up the diary from the floor. A loose page had fallen out, one they hadn't seen before, written in a different hand. Not Eleanor's, but someone else's, jagged and hurried. "There's more," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She read aloud. "The traveler lied. The ritual was not hers. Charles paid me to bind her soul, to silence her forever. She fights, but she is not the curse. Forgive me." Sarah's breath caught. "Charles trapped her?" she asked, her mind reeling. "Then what was the curse?" Clara shook her head, closing the diary. Maybe it wasn't just Eleanor's anger. Maybe it was her pain, twisted by someone else's magic. We freed her, Sarah. That's what matters. Sarah wanted to believe it, but the weight of the house pressed down on her, its shadows still too deep. She held Ethan closer, his warmth grounding her, and prayed Clara was right. The next morning, the Victorian house felt different. Lighter, like a fever had broken. Sunlight streamed through the windows, a rare break in Portland's endless rain, and the air smelled of clean wood, not mildew. Sarah stood in the kitchen, brewing coffee, her hands still shaky from the night before. Ethan was upstairs, packing his sketchbook and clothes, his movements slow but normal. Jake was on the porch, sipping a soda, his leather jacket slung over a chair. Clara had left at dawn, promising to return with more answers about the diary's final page. Sarah and Ethan decided to stay in the house, at least for now. Selling it felt wrong, like abandoning a wounded thing that had finally started to heal. They spent the day cleaning, scrubbing the living room floor where the salt circle had been, tossing out the charred remains of the portrait. Ethan didn't talk about what happened, and Sarah didn't push. His eyes were clear, his smile tentative, and that was enough for now. Jake stuck around, canceling a trucking job to help with repairs. He and Sarah talked late into the night, mending old wounds from their years apart. "You're tougher than I thought," he said, grinning as he hammered a loose board on the porch. Sarah laughed, the sound foreign after so long. "You're not so bad yourself," she replied, handing him a nail. Clara called a week later, her voice excited. She'd found records confirming the diary's twist. Charles Grayson had hired a conman, posing as a mystic, to trap Eleanor's soul in the portrait, hoping to silence her accusations about William's murder. The conman's ritual had gone wrong, binding Eleanor's pain to the house, turning her grief into something darker. Clara wrote an article for the local paper, painting Eleanor as a tragic figure, not a witch. She sent Sarah a copy, along with a photocopy of the diary, as a keepsake. Sarah framed the article, hanging it in the foyer where the portrait's shadow no longer loomed. The house wasn't perfect, leaky pipes, creaky floors, but it felt like there's now a home instead of a prison. Ethan went back to school, his sketchbook filled with new drawings. Trees, the river, anything but faces. He played his music loud, argued about chores, and rolled his eyes at Sarah's rules, just like before. She cherished every moment of it. But some nights Sarah couldn't sleep. She'd lie in bed, listening to the house settle, half expecting to hear that whisper again. One evening, while organizing the attic, she found an empty frame tucked behind a pile of boxes, its wood carved with the same vines as the portraits. She locked it in the trunk, telling herself it was nothing, just another relic of the house's past. Ethan, meanwhile, kept one secret. In his closet, hidden under a pile of old comics, was a single drawing he hadn't shown Sarah. It was rough, done in pencil, showing a man's face, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, a stranger's features. He didn't know who it was, or why he'd drawn it. It had come to him in a dream, the night after the ritual, along with a faint whisper, not Eleanor's voice but someone else's, low and urgent. "Find me." He didn't tell Sarah. She'd been through enough, and he wasn't sure it meant anything. But sometimes, when the house was quiet, he'd take out the drawing and stare at it, wondering if the curse was truly gone, or if the Grayson family's secrets were deeper than they'd ever know. The rain returned to Portland, a soft drizzle that blurred the world outside. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching the drops slide down the glass, and felt a strange peace. The house was hers, flaws and all, and she'd fight for it, for Ethan, for their future. But as she turned off the light, a faint creak came from the attic, like a door easing open. She froze, then shook her head, locking the kitchen door behind her. Some sounds, she decided, were better left ignored.